I hope most of you did learn something. I certainly did. I hope most of you were able to join us for lunch today and hear that great panel. My name is Joel Brammeier. I'm the president of the Alliance for the Great Lakes, and I am here strictly today as a moderator, so you're not going to hear a lot from me other than a little introduction and some Q&A. We've got three great panelists today who are going to follow on that conversation about the future vision for the Chicago River with some more detailed information and with some hard numbers behind some of the changes and potential opportunities that are happening here associated with the waterways. I know a lot of people in this room, maybe everybody is motivated to be here out of a shared concern for the quality of the Chicago River, the quality of the experience that the people who live here have with it, and also a concern about the potential risk that those rivers pose to the Great Lakes and to the Mississippi River. The great thing about where we are today is that we're starting to move this conversation beyond simple statements and some of the acrimony that has been part of this debate into a place where we're actually looking at hard numbers, real futures for the Chicago River, real potential investments, and even the possibility of local municipal governments getting involved in finding a solution to the risks that the Chicago River poses to the Great Lakes. I was really pleased on Monday. I was part of a discussion, a small part of a discussion with the Great Lakes Commission, where the local director of our Metropolitan Water Reclamation District was present as well, and he had some interesting words to say about their potential role as a partner in dealing with the risk posed to the Great Lakes by the Chicago River, and we'll get more into that in a little bit, I'm sure. So we've got three great panelists today representing three distinct perspectives on what the future of Chicago's rivers can be. And we're going to go in, I believe, actually not quite in the order that you see them here. But first up, we're going to have Frank Manzo from the Illinois Economic and Policy Institute. And if you came in, you saw these sitting on the table. Has everybody at least seen one, if you don't have one yet? Clean water means jobs. I think I just gave Frank's presentation, so I can probably just cut it off right there.
Thanks, everyone.
But the bottom line is, I'll just introduce this by saying, we are here in Chicago in the midst of a multi-billion-dollar clean water investment that's happening around you. If you go on the river tour today, you're going to see some evidence of that. Those numbers shouldn't scare anybody in this room. We do think big in Chicago about how to build clean water. And Frank's going to give us a little bit of information about how that's actually coming together on the labor side. He's been doing some great work in partnership with the Sierra Club. I know a number of Sierra Club staff from Illinois are here in the room. So, Frank, with that, let's take it away and get started.
Okay. Should I go here or come on up?
Either way, whatever you prefer.
Right.
Got it.
Take your spot. Sure. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Frank Manzo. Just a very quick background. The Illinois Economic Policy Institute, we provide timely economic research in support of broad-based prosperity for all Illinois residents. And that's my sheet, so I'm going to pick it up real quick. Sorry about that. So broad-based prosperity for all Illinois residents. And that's the same, too. We have a doing business as the Midwest Economic Policy Institute. That's kind of a division of our organization. So anytime we touch on the greater Great Lakes area, we tend to use that name. But what we're all about really is investment. So that's investment in infrastructure, investment in education, and investment in communities. Now today I obviously wanted to briefly talk about the economic impacts of clean water investments. Now with 10 minutes, if you figure it's best to kind of have more of a conversational type approach to the presentation, so I'm not going to use a PowerPoint. But anytime I don't use a PowerPoint, I like to have the audience remember a couple numbers. So that's kind of how this presentation is going to go. I'm going to have you remember 4 numbers this afternoon. The first number, as long as I remember, is $36 billion. $36 billion. That is the estimated amount of funding needed to improve and expand Illinois' clean water infrastructure over the next 20 years. One state, $36 billion. This includes investment in wastewater plants, AIS removal, just really anything you can think of. The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, I'm sure you've heard a lot about. The Chicago River, of course. You name it, $36 billion is needed just in one state. And we all know the causes: aging infrastructure, changes in population, changes in use, changes in purpose. Of course, the threats from global climate change. All of those are, of course, some of the causes. But perhaps the biggest problem, and this might be more of an opinion of my own, but perhaps the biggest problem is just unwillingness, I guess, or maybe you could put it as indifference. But it's unwillingness to leave a clean environment for the next generation or the generation after that, or it's an unwillingness to use taxpayer dollars as an investment engine for the future, as an investment engine to grow the economy. And that leads me to my second number. So that was $36 billion. Now I want you to remember the number $1.50. $1.50. $1.50 is the average economic return per dollar invested in clean water infrastructure and clean water projects. Now this kind of fluctuates depending on kind of who you ask or the data that we analyze, or maybe a specific project or a specific part of the country or world. The Water Research Foundation says it's $1.64. The Congressional Research Service is a little more conservative and says it's somewhere between $1.30 and $1.50. But the general tendency is $1.50 per dollar invested in infrastructure projects, clean water projects. That's how much is returned to the economy. So let's kind of put that $1.50 in perspective. It's better than that return is greater, I should say, than a comparable or similarly sized, tax cut. So that is, just really to put a better way, to invest $1 billion in clean water infrastructure, you get a larger return to the economy than by cutting personal income taxes by $1 billion. That return is also greater than a comparable increase in military spending, I guess, to put it also in a different type of perspective, another spending perspective. And kind of what I really wanted to point out is it's part of a broader finding that I see time after time, study after study in the economic research. And that finding really is just that the best thing the government can do to grow the economy is to make physical capital investments and human capital investments. Now, there's so many things the government needs to do and should do. Redistribution of income, public assistance. All of these are important, and they factor into policy decision making. But the thing the government can do best to grow the economy, from the perspective of growing the economy, if that's what we want the government to do, is to invest in infrastructure and education. So that's roads, bridges, public transportation systems, rail, wastewater facilities, beaches, right? Schools, freshwater facilities. All of those are physical capital investments, and then we also have public education. We have, early childhood education. We have apprenticeship training programs, funding to support scientific research, or just a general understanding of science. I mean, these are human capital investments that pay off. But of course, to invest money, you also need to save money. So another thing we find, too, that correlates really well with economic growth is, of course, balanced budgets. We also support that. But the point of that is that we can grow the economy by implementing a slight tax increase, as long as those dollars go to invest, towards these investments we're talking about, clean water infrastructure investments, a great opportunity for the state of Illinois, for the region, for the city of Chicago, for the world. So that $1.50, just really quick to put a cap on it, that $1.50 creates economic activity, creates jobs. The third number that I want you to remember is $163, and that's on the handout I have there too. $163 per hour, actually. According to data compiled by the Census Bureau and the U.S. Department of Commerce, the average blue-collar construction worker in Illinois working on a water project, so say the Chicago River, the average blue-collar construction worker working on that project generates $163 per hour toward the state economy. Now, it seems like a lot, right? It's updating infrastructure, it's reducing pollution, it's preventing contamination, restoring the Great Lakes, restoring the Chicago River, eliminating disruptions from business activity so that they're not disrupted from floods or sewer breaks or leaks. Construction workers improve the economy by $163 per hour. This is extraordinary productivity. So who wins from this productivity? Of course, the blue-collar construction workers themselves win, and deservedly so. The average hourly compensation in this sector in Illinois is $44 an hour. So this is another thing. It's one of the things we support, prevailing wage. One of the things I just want you to think about next time you look up a prevailing wage rate. on a water project and you're wondering why a laborer or an operating engineer earns between $40 and $50 an hour, and you think they're overpaid, because they're working on a sewer project along the side of the road in your neighborhood. Why are they earning so much? I just want you to remember that they're generating 4 times that amount in economic return to your community. And then you also need to remember, of course, that they only work 9 months out of the year, and they want to, in order to get to the $50,000, $60,000 middle class lifestyle, you have to earn a little more per hour. That they also, get 3 to 5 years of apprenticeship training to actually get the skills to do that job, and also it's a dangerous job. So blue-collar workers benefit, white-collar workers, lawyers, architects, the engineers, office support workers, they also benefit. Contractors clearly benefit from having a highly productive workforce. And then there is what we were talking about earlier, that kind of spill over to the rest of the economy, that $1.50. And the final number that I want you to consider is 20,000. The Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago and the City of Chicago Department of Water Management together save or create nearly 20,000 jobs every year. So these 20,000 jobs, the number I want you to remember, is, they reduce unemployment in the Chicago region. They grow the economy by nearly $2 billion. That's another number, but you don't need to remember that one. And they improve, of course, health and environmental outcomes in this region. The tunnel and reservoir plan, that's an example of one of these programs. That creates or saves nearly 2,000 jobs a year. That program is, it's 110 miles of deep tunnel that are being excavated over a long period of time. So that program, you have the Space to Grow program with the Chicago Public Schools. I'm not sure if you guys are aware of that, but we can talk a little more about that too. That's in low-income areas. The Chicago Riverwalk. I mean, all of these, each of these programs is a job creator. And I know my time is almost up. So I guess I want to end by saying, here in Chicago, here in Illinois, across the Great Lakes region, we need to ensure that our economy flows smoothly. So, here's the list: nutrient removal, green infrastructure projects, reducing CSOs, dam removal, invasive species control, continuing the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. Each of these is an opportunity for future investment in Illinois and in the region, and of course, extend that out to the country. And then lastly, it's a win-win-win. So it's a win for the blue-collar construction workers, or just for workers who are offered more middle-class job opportunities. It's a win for the public because you have the better environmental quality, fewer disruptions to business life and obviously family life. And it's a win for private businesses through the ripple effects throughout the economy. So I want to thank you for your time, and I'll take your numbers on some of those questions later. Or take your questions on some of those numbers later. See you.
Thanks, Frank. So Frank is taking numbers later.
Take people's numbers too.
Put this in a little context before our next speaker. So we're, as I mentioned in my opening comments, we're in the midst here in Illinois of what I think will amount to approximately $4 billion investment in clean water since the early 70s, dealing with an existing sewage overflow and flooding problem. In addition to that, there are investments in the billions of dollars that need to be made by the city of Chicago and other communities in the area to address additional flooding and sewage overflow problems. And in addition to that, we have investments that would be needed to be made in order for us to confront or to create the kind of waterway system that's necessary to solve the problem with Asian carp and other invasive species. So the kinds of productivity figures that Frank is mentioning here all come back to numbers that will be produced as a result of the investments in the Chicago waterway system that are necessary to solve our clean water problems and our invasive species problem. And so in that spirit, and knowing that that's the case, and the outsized role that our local sewage district can potentially play in helping us solve some of these problems, I want to introduce Commissioner Deborah Shore from the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. Deborah is a colleague and a friend, and has been instrumental in transforming the commission of the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District into a bluer and greener commission over the last decade. So, Deborah, welcome.
Thank you, Joel, and good afternoon, everyone. Before I plunge in to parts of the topic, I did want to share with you some news I heard recently that the You're probably aware that the Washington Redskins have come under a lot of criticism and flack for their name, so they've decided to drop Washington. You've learned a lot about the Chicago area waterways. It's been said that all problems started out as solutions. 130 years ago, the solution to the problem of Chicago's contaminated drinking water was to dig a series of canals, reverse the Chicago River, and use water from Lake Michigan to flush sewage downstream, protecting the drinking water supply for a teeming and growing metropolis. And I would suggest that it worked magnificently, allowed Chicago to become a great metropolis, but in turn has created several other problems, such as a conduit for invasive species to move between Lake Michigan and the Mississippi, and a diversion of fresh water from Lake Michigan and the Lake Michigan watershed. When the plan was devised by the Chicago Sanitary District to dig this canal, there was no EPA. There was no understanding truly of ecosystems, and they were dealing with an imminent public health threat. That plan would never be approved today. It probably wouldn't have been approved 40 years ago. But in 1889, it was. It was conceived of as an open sewer pipe to convey raw sewage downstream and as a route for commercial barge traffic between the Mississippi and Lake Michigan. I don't think anyone ever imagined for many, many years that people would want to canoe or kayak or fish or boat along these waterways. And yet, in large part due to the efforts of the sanitary district, building sewage treatment plants, working with industry to clean up their acts, the waterways are much cleaner than they used to be, where once there were no fish, now there are 70 species, and people are wanting and demanding and deserving higher water quality. So I'll touch upon a number of points as quickly as I can. In part because of this increased recreational use along sections of the waterway, the Water Reclamation District is installing disinfection technology at 2 of the larger plants. The Calumet plant went operational earlier, about a month ago, using chlorine and dechlorination. The Northside plant that discharges into the North Shore Channel near Howard Street is installing ultraviolet light, and that will be ready to go online in March of next year for the recreational season. One of the other initiatives that I'm very excited about is nutrient removal through a new process, and those of you who may see it if you go on the tour of Stickney, the district is adopting a biological removal process that will take 1,100 tons a year of phosphorus out of the discharged wastewater and turn it into a slow-release fertilizer that we can sell that's not water soluble. We'll produce something in the Midwest that can be used in the Midwest, turn a vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle, and generate revenue for the taxpayers of Cook County. And this will actually help the state reach substantial progress towards its goals of reducing phosphorus in the waterways. You heard about the tunnel and reservoir plan. This was conceived to reduce pollution in the waterways by capturing stormwater and removing contaminants. The 109 miles of tunnel was completed in May of 2006 and can hold 2.5 billion gallons of stormwater runoff and has done so many times. That's held in that underground reservoir until before it's discharged into the waterways. The Majewski Reservoir, 325 million gallons, has been online since the late 80s, I believe. The Thornton Reservoir, we had a ribbon cutting ceremony last month. It will be operational later, probably in October, and can capture 7.9 billion gallons of stormwater overflow. And we're negotiating to use an additional 3 billion gallon lobe of that reservoir, so we may be able to significantly bump up the capture there. And the first phase of the McCook Reservoir is due to be completed in late 2017 that will hold 3.5 billion gallons of stormwater overflow. The hope when this was designed is that these would reduce or eliminate combined sewer overflows in the Chicago region. My worry is that with the more intense rain events that we've been experiencing due to climate change, we don't have the conveyance to get these huge rainstorms to the larger intercepting sewers, to the drop shafts, to the reservoirs. So we may have to build some additional conveyance to help deal with these changes in our weather patterns. We launched 2 new debris removal boats this summer called Skimmy Dipper and Skim Pickens. They're on call 24 hours to go to the sites of combined sewer overflows and remove floatables and other debris from the Chicago River. Because even though these were man-made canals, they've been around for 100 years and have become special places for people and other creatures. And you can see turtles and herons and beaver, and they become important sacred places, if you will, in our landscape. So we're doing what we can to clean them up. Finally, I was asked to talk about the changes in the board. We have a board of 9 commissioners, I'm one of them, elected at large throughout Cook County for 6-year terms. So 3 seats are up every 2 years. And you run in the second largest county in the country for an obscure office that very few people know what it does, even though we have a $1.2 billion budget this year. And the agency, through managing stormwater and treating wastewater, has significant role to play in the management of our water resources. There will be 2 new members of the board by December of 2016. One of the incumbents is retiring, and another joined the Chicago City Council. So I would encourage you to pay close attention to the candidates on the ballot next March in the primary. That's what's determinative. There are a number that have significant skill sets that would be an asset to the board, and there may be some who will take us not in a progressive direction. And it matters a lot, so please try to educate yourselves about this election, and even volunteer to help some of the candidates. Finally, I would say I've been in some discussions and people are starting to ask, what does intelligent decision-making for water resource management look like in our region in the 21st century? Does it make sense to have this bifurcation of drinking water, stormwater, wastewater? Or should we be managing the entire water cycle in a better way and a more thoughtful way? And I think we have an opportunity to make some proposals and rethink that. I'll be happy to answer questions later, and I'm sure you may have them. It's been an honor and a privilege to serve the people of Cook County and to be at this agency at a time when it's making a significant shift from a sleepy giant into a resource recovery agency. And I believe the sewage treatment plants of the past will be the power centers of the future. We're going to generate renewable energy. We're on a path to be energy neutral in 8 years. We're going to recover phosphorus at a time when the phosphate reserves in mines around the world are being exhausted, and the remaining phosphate in rock is in politically unstable places, and among those I include the state of Florida. We're going to be finding beneficial uses for our biosolids, and we're beginning to look at reuse of the treated water as a strategic asset and an economic asset. So it's an exciting time to be here, and thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. And I really do appreciate the comments about the scale of the work that the district is doing, and this transition from I think you said a sleepy agency that nobody knows much about, to one that is really punching at or above its weight and being a true steward of the public purse. So thank you for that. By the way, those names, what was it? Skim Pickens and Skimmy Dipper actually came from your moderator at lunch, Josh Ellis, the comedian who ran the panel. So that happens a lot around here. So I know that many of you are familiar with the Great Lakes and Mississippi River Interbasin Study. I did manage to say that all at once. Glimmerous. And I know you're also probably mostly familiar with the dollar figures that were cited in that study. Somewhere, I think it was $4 to $8 billion to $12 billion to $18 billion for a solution to the invasive species problem. Now, the reality is that the vast majority of those costs in any of those plans were really about fixing broken water infrastructure here in northeastern Illinois and creating the system that makes it possible to solve the invasive species problem. Those are numbers that can be addressed, I think, more efficiently and more effectively in partnership with agencies like MWRD, and we look forward to continuing those conversations and really getting a handle on the true cost of creating a system that allows us to fix the invasive species problem, solve flooding, and potentially even put water from the rivers back into Lake Michigan, which is certainly something I aspire to someday. However, there's another piece of that plan that we have to talk about, and that has to do with transportation on the waterways. And I'm really pleased today that we have Elaine McKenzie from Cambridge Systematics. Cambridge Systematics is a global I'm sure they do many things, but they do transportation planning and statistical analysis for developing plans for transportation systems around the world. I know they've done some great work with the city of Chicago looking at the waterborne transportation system here in northeastern Illinois, and have recently partnered with the Natural Resources Defense Council to do a deep look at how the Chicago waterway is functioning from a transportation perspective and what the future might hold. So with that, Elaine, I'll uncover your presentation and you can come on over.
Great, thank you. All right. Will I screw everything up if I try to use this microphone? So I'm an engineer, so they don't let me out of the office unless I have slides. So this is what we have today. But as Joel mentioned, I work with Cambridge Systematics. We're a firm that focuses on transportation planning and policy. Specifically, I work with freight transportation. So that is my world. And my colleague, Erica Witzke, who I worked with on this study, which is one of my favorite projects that I've ever done, we looked at in great detail about what shipping and industry is using the Chicago area waterway system or the cause. And this was work done for the NRDC, as Joel mentioned, and they have just released their issue paper on this topic. And in addition to that, there's a technical analysis paper that was developed by my firm that's a companion piece. And so both of these are available online. The NRDC paper, Revitalizing the Chicago Area Waterway System. Malia Gertzma is also in the room with NRDC, so any questions that I can't answer, she can probably do as well. But like I said, my world that I look at revolves around freight. And the waterways are an important part of the freight transportation system in the U.S., although not always the one that people think of, when you're talking about freight. It's more rail and truck are the more visible modes. But the inland waterways move 6 to 7% of domestic cargo. And so there's a significant portion of goods that are moving on the system. One of the things that I want to point out that is happening recently is more investment nationally in the system in looking at the marine highway system. So if you didn't know, parts of the cause are designated as Marine Highway 55 because it goes along with I-55. And then the Great Lakes are actually Marine Highway 90 along with I-90. And so the idea is to look at the waterway system as a component that works in conjunction with the roads and with the railway system. However, as have been mentioned by many people, there's a lot of issues on the waterway system, and a backlog of infrastructure investment is part of that. And that's one of the things that we looked at for this study, and I'll overview just briefly today. But to throw out a number, Frank threw out quite a few, but I'll give you one more. The estimated need on the waterway system nationally is over $62 billion. Now, the budget for the Army Corps of Engineers to start addressing these programs is less than $5 billion a year, and there's many other things that they do with that budget. So we are not only significantly underinvesting, but the underinvestment is growing. We have a fix-on failure policy. Essentially, when something gets so bad you can't use it anymore, that's when it goes into the queue for being fixed. So as part of this study, we looked at infrastructure issues, and we also looked at what industries were using the system. And so I'll overview a little bit of that today. And you can find much more information in the 2 reports available online. I obviously can't get through everything in 10 minutes. So when we're thinking about goods movement, again, getting back to the thought of this as a regional transportation system, not just a waterway system, there's a lot of impacts from the economy in general on how people use the waterway system. We used to be a big manufacturing center with lots of bulk, heavy materials, heavy goods, and that's not quite true anymore. So we're not importing as many of those goods into the region, which means we don't need the waterway system as much for barge transportation for some goods. However, and I want to stress this, and Josh Ellis stressed this as well in his presentation, it is still very important for key activities, for the construction sector, for other major manufacturing and industrial uses in Chicago. Just to throw out a few figures, 69% of freight in Chicago moves via truck and 4% moves via waterway. I want you to remember that 4% for the end, since we're all like practice remembering numbers now. And the other thing I want to point out is just, as we're doing the study, one of the things that came up, not just for waterways, but for all transportation modes, is that connectivity is key. We're not in the position where goods move just on, from origin to destination, and, that's it. You get on a truck, you move to a distribution center, you move to a port, you move to, somewhere where you're offloaded, and then you're going to your final destination. And all of these links are an important part of the system. In terms of overall volumes moving on the system, this is looking at this red line at the top is the entire Chicago waterway system. These lines are different pieces of the system, and you notice that they don't line up because there is, if you're looking at segments of the system, there are some that overlaps. If you move from one end to the other, you kind of get counted in both of these bars, which is why, obviously these two don't add up to a little bit more than the total. But what I want you to see here is that the use is declining, but there are a couple of areas that there is still heavy use of the cause for barge shipping. Specifically, 2 regions to call out is the Sanitary and Ship Canal and the area around Calumet Harbor. And so the Sanitary and Ship Canal, and this is southwest of the city, is kind of this connection down to the Illinois River from the Chicago River. And then the Calumet Harbor region is this area east of Lake Calumet that's past the T.J. O'Brien Lock. There's a lot of industry located over there that rely on the cause for their businesses. One other thing I do want to note is that, as we saw, there's traffic moving on different parts of the system. And what we found is the majority of the traffic is either moving on this western piece or moving on this eastern piece in the Calumet region. Less than a third of traffic is transversing those 2 regions. So the idea that the cause is a connection between the Mississippi River system and the Great Lakes system, which is something that may have been more true in the past. But what we're seeing is there's a lot of commerce that's moving more locally on different pieces of the system, and this has impacts when you're thinking about anything from water quality to separation. So I just want to look very quickly at a few of the commodities. We did a few profiles and looked at specific commodities and uses in general. Coal used to be a huge user of the cause, but in the last few years we've closed 3 power plants, so they're obviously not taking goods anymore. Petcoke is another is another product that everybody I'm sure is aware of has been causing some issues lately. If you go out and look down in the Calumet region, there used to be these huge piles of pet coke because in Illinois you could store them outside and you couldn't store them outside in Indiana. If you go look at them now and you can see kind of, this is a picture taken recently, it's black, but it's a very flat pile. It's it's being moved. It's not this giant pile of essentially waste product that's sitting outside anymore. So these were huge users of the system that really aren't going to be there in the future. These are a couple of industries that are now using the system and are continuing to do that and will be doing that in the future. And Josh Ellis mentioned these at lunch as well. Concrete. You need to bring in a lot of sand, a lot of gravel to be able to construct buildings, to construct roadways. And this is something that is a key user of the barge transportation system now. Another thing that you might not realize unless you live by one of these plants is scrap metal. All of those things, if you put your refrigerator out in the alley to be picked up, if you are a manufacturing plant that has scrap metal products, these are all brought to consolidation centers and different companies within the city, and some of them are shipping them out via barge. So you'll see this barge full of scrap metal that's destined for export or for different uses. A few more findings, and I'll just touch briefly on these. As I mentioned at the beginning, the investments is lagging, and because of this, we're lacking resiliency. So it's really hard to plan to use the system in the future if you don't know what it's going to be like, and you don't know if you're going to be able to get your goods from your supplier to your industry. And so there's one thing a new report that actually just came out this week is there's a TRB report, the Transportation Research Board, just put out a special report, 315 I think is the number, and it looks at waterway funding and issues. So if this is something that you're interested in, I highly recommend checking out that report. And just to mention a few of the challenges that we have in the cause, we're at a very small part of the river. So if you look on the Mississippi, you'll see these big barge tows of 9 barges all linked together. We can't do that here. We can have one at a time. And they have to go through low overhead structures, so you have to have a different type of barge pilot house. This is one area of the river that's very narrow, so you see there's no really good fleeting area, so they're just kind of sitting here on the side of the road. This is southwest of the city, and so it's really hard to travel through there, and kind of get by. So all of these things slow down the system. One other thing to mention, people even on the cause, this is the ArcelorMittal plant. They are, they're right there. This is down in the Calumet region. But this plant has really good rail access. What you don't see is you don't see them using the barges. There's trees along the waterway. So even industries and locations that previously were reliant on the waterway system may not be in the future, or may not be using it now. There's a lot of different stories for the future that are being told. And two, I won't get into too much detail because we've talked about these. The Chicago Downtown Riverwalk is one. And there's also things being done in the Calumet region all along the waterfront. So I'm being told I have to stop, and this is my last slide. So we'll wrap up now. I told you that number 4%. 4% doesn't seem like a lot of traffic, but if you think about every barge is the equivalent of 70 trucks. Imagine 4% more traffic multiplied by 70 trucks moving through the city. And so this is one of the considerations when you're thinking about, the waterway system for industry and what function it serves. You can't just remove it without taking into consideration where is this freight going to go, because you still need to keep commerce moving. You need to build things, and this is being a key part of the system. And so last thing I'll wrap up with, because I think this is just a really good sentence. This is one of the recommendations from the NRDC issue paper that directly deals with freight transportation, is the idea that we need to do more multimodal planning. We need to really integrate this the waterway system into our freight transportation plans. And so the way that it's phrased is that we need to conduct a detailed multimodal assessment and future vision for freight, infrastructure, and operations that approach the waterway as an included part of the regional and national goods movement system while reducing the impact on freight on communities. So I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine. Some really important data points in there regarding the relevance of that connection between the Great Lakes and Mississippi River and some of those real specialized uses here in Chicago. I'll ask one question, and then I know we probably have a lot of opportunities for questions and discussion with the audience. So, short of we were talking big numbers, billions of dollars, great job opportunities, some major transitions happening. Short of a natural disaster, where have you seen us move past that fix on failure policy and actually develop the impetus for multi-billion-dollar infrastructure investment successfully in the last 10 years? And that's not a trick question.
Yeah. So I think a good example of this is actually in the Chicago region. The CREATE program, which is a 10-year-old ongoing multi-billion-dollar investment in rail, really looked at the system in Chicago, which is the focal point for rail in the U.S. You know, the majority of goods moving from the West Coast, if you're shipping something from China and it's going through California and it's going to Boston, it's coming through Chicago. And we saw that as an issue. It was a choke point. It took as long to get from Los Angeles to Chicago as it did to get, the 20 miles through the city of Chicago. And so this plan was developed and is being implemented strategically in partnership with the railroads to be able to address that. Right now, we don't have the same sort of impetus or the same sort of charge on the waterway system to say, this is important, this is a strategic part of the system. And I think that's one of the things that's needed, is to be able to take that view to say, here's how this affects national commerce, and here's the investment that we need to make to protect our industry, protect our economy, and to make the waterway, to make the waterway better for users. And saying that, I'm coming from the perspective of freight transportation, but I believe that this can be done, and there's been discussion, in conjunction with clean water and other initiatives. So I'm not advocating for one over the other, but let's look for a combined solution.
Any other comments on that? So we'll go to the audience. Comments, questions. You may have questions for our panelists or potentially for each other. So anybody want to get started? Back here. Sorry, Dave. I'm going to pass over Dave because I know I'll get to him next.
So for Elaine, I'm wondering if you can name some specific strategies that design in flexibility to the system for the variation in commodities markets. Like you see in manufacturing, people going to flex space, and I'm wondering if that's being done in ports as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we talked to a few industries through this and other studies, and one of the things that we learned is that no one's really relying on just the waterway system anymore. They'll bring something in via water, but then they may also have a rail connection, or sometimes they'll bring things in via truck, or they'll bring in raw materials via the waterway and ship them out, ship out finished goods another way. And I think that's the way that we're moving towards, and need to think about in terms of public infrastructure as well. Getting back to the Marine Highway Program, how can the waterway help with overall transportation? How can it be thought of as a corridor where there's multiple options to get from a supplier to shipper, for example, as opposed to just thinking about it as the waterway system itself?
Thank you, Joel. Dave Ulrich with Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative. Just a quick comment and a question, coming for you, Commissioner Shore. First of all, a comment. People should be aware that Joel's description of the transformation of the Water Reclamation District from, I'll call it, brown and gray to green and blue, Commissioner Shore is probably the single person most responsible for that transformation. So all of us in Cook County, thank you for that. Mm-hmm. Secondly, I recall a meeting that you and I had maybe 5 or 6 years ago when we started to talk about the Chicago River and the Chicago waterway system. And I think you said words to the effect of, Dave, what we really need to do is redefine how we see the Chicago River and the Chicago waterway system. And I think you were right. What I'd like to know is, what is your definition of the Chicago River and the Chicago Waterway system of the future?
It's a multi-use, multi-purpose, urban working waterway system, and has many demands upon it for capturing stormwater, recreation, commercial use, habitat. I see it as a vital artery threaded through the heart of a great metropolis. And it's exciting to see the development. People are no longer turning their backs on the waterways, but embracing them. It's an important economic asset as we see development and redevelopment along portions of the waterways. So I think it can be part of a great attribute to this great metropolis, but recognize that it will always have some limitations built in because of its construction, because of the need to maintain certain flows as long as it is used for freight transport and
Questions?
Tom Healy. Surprisingly little has been said about Asian carp and the proposals, in particular the feasibility study done by the Army Corps of Engineers on the various options for controlling invasive species. I'd be interested in the panelists' views on, first, the urgency of that problem, which seems to have fallen out of the limelight, and secondly, what's the most feasible, cost-effective solution?
You guys first.
Not to put you on the spot.
It has fallen off of the radar screen in many places. I think that is, if and when live carp are found upstream of the electric barriers, they will leap into the headlines again. Much is being done, and I'm not fully apprised of all the research being done, but in a variety of ways to try to find other approaches to control and deal with carp, biological, chemical, and so forth. Some has been done to ramp up commercial harvest. Personally, I favor doing much more of that. If we can take as many fish as possible out of the river downstream, it will give the barriers a better chance of working. If there's one thing we know how to do, it's how to overfish a fishery to near extinction. And they can be used for, already are exported for human consumption, but can be used as fertilizer, pet food, humanitarian food aid, and so forth. So I certainly don't think we've done as much as we could to promote and implement harvest. But it's been also noted that we as a species are not well adapted to the slow-growing threat, the long emergency, and we are lulled in, I don't know whether we'll be able to take measures in time to deal with them.
Yeah, the only other thing I was going to really add is that in terms of the feasibility of it, I think, personally, probably it's most feasible when you are able to combine it with other measures to reduce, flooding, other measures to improve water quality. That invasive species problem is included in that $36 billion. That first number I told you guys over 20 years, that need that over the next 2 decades to improve water quality. So I mean, there's a need to address it for sure.
I think, if I can take prerogative, I think one of the reasons we're not spending a lot of time talking about it is because everybody in this room, I think, knows how urgent that problem is, and we really need to craft a Chicago waterway that can address that problem and a series of others that our panelists have talked about in a rational way that works. We know we have one solution that we know will work. That's physical separation. We know that doesn't work for everybody. I'll acknowledge that. And we need to look at a couple of other things to make sure we really understand how much risk reduction they can provide to the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. And we need the Army Corps to step up and do that. I'm optimistic that there's a local partnership that can be built to do some of the work that I don't think the Army Corps can, because it really requires local partnership and local investment to make progress. So, Judy, I know you had your hand up.
Judy Beck. So one of the things that was really encouraging was to actually have facts and figures and a good detailed study of one of the systems that uses the cause. And so my question is, are there plans to get studies like this for the stormwater system, you know, including all the suburbs and the other systems that are part of this very complex, we're overusing the word system, but, you know, of the very complex system that it is? And also, is there money being spent similar to this on the other 18 openings for carp into the Great Lakes? And that's just on the U.S. side. It's really good to have the numbers and the studies, but is there the same effort going on other places?
Address the first part,
The Water Reclamation District is supporting the development of 100-year stormwater plans for municipalities throughout Cook County, but only the first 5 will be completed by the end of this year. So that's a long-term prospect. Whether those studies will include an analysis of the costs that you're talking about, I don't know yet.
Judy, I know one thing I can add to that is I know and I believe the city of Chicago acknowledges that it has its own stormwater problem, both related to MWRD but also independent of MWRD. And the city is doing its own planning for how to address its obligations to deal with stormwater and combined sewage as well. So I know that that's going on. In response, I think, you know, your second question was maybe directed to me, but not that I have perfect knowledge of that. But clearly, there is, I would argue, there is a need for a significantly greater investment in prevention here in northeastern Illinois than at the other locations you mentioned, not because they're not important or not because they're not potential vectors for invasion, but because the one here in northeastern Illinois is by far the highest risk to both the Great Lakes and Mississippi River, and because those other vectors can be addressed at a lower cost. That's my take on it.
Well, but I guess my main point is that for people to have confidence that they're at lower cost and that this is the place to spend what will likely be national dollars, you've got to bring everyone along, and the picture needs to be very clear. And we're talking about a system, but it's also part of a major system.
Yeah.
And I forgot to say that I'm a riparian owner on the west fork of the North Branch of the Chicago River. And so there are lots of dollars that are being spent now that need to be accounted for, because we've got FEMA buyouts, we've got MWRD work, so there's other money that's being spent, and we need to have that as part of the whole.
Right. And so Judy's point is a good one in that to get to the solution that I think the Great Lakes and Mississippi River need, and to get to the level of investment that's necessary to make that real, we have to deal with stormwater, we have to deal with flooding and protecting people's property, and we have to deal with transportation. Because as much as it pains me to say it, invasive species alone does not drive billions of dollars of investment. And so I'm optimistic that we've started to build that partnership to make that possible. More questions? I think we have time for at least one more. Dave?
Yeah, Dave Spangler. Question on the phosphorus removal. What technology is that, and are you at liberty to discuss what it cost?
Sure. So there's a company called Ostara, O-S-T-A-R-A, based in Vancouver, British Columbia, and 2 researchers from the University of British Columbia developed this process, launched this company. It's already being done by Clean Water Services in Portland, Oregon, by the utility in Madison, Wisconsin, by several others. If you look up crystal green, and I'd be happy to give you this sample, it'll tell you how it works. the Water Reclamation District is investing $35 million in building a facility at the Stickney plant to take the centrate coming off the anaerobic digesters. There's a process to capture and then release the phosphorus, and it will get converted into these crystals. These will get sold to a commercial fertilizer blender, mix it with some magnesium and nitrate, and sold in the Midwest. Their field research has shown a great deal of efficacy with potatoes, strawberries, and high-protein alfalfa. So they're looking to commercial fertilizer blenders in Wisconsin and potato states. But Ostera wants to pay the district $400 a ton. And we're going to produce 10,000 tons a year of these crystals. We'll have to spend about $300 a ton on chemicals, but there will be a positive revenue stream. And eventually we'll make back our investment and generate revenue, getting ahead of what we know are more stringent regulations coming to limit the amount of phosphorus that can be discharged. This just does it in a way that converts a waste product into a resource that has value.
So invasive species and nutrients are connected in more ways than one, right? A round of applause for our panelists.